Conventional wisdom indicates that traditional religion is stronger today than it has been in at least 50 years. Churches, especially so-called mega-churches, such as Rick Warren's Saddleback Church, which has 11 locations around the world and a weekly attendance of 22,000, these churches continue to grow. And we have a president who, even though he's not especially religious himself, not so subtly uses religion to achieve his political ends, more than most previous presidents would have dared. And yet I believe that the voice of atheism, or skepticism, or secular humanism, the voice of the infidel or heretic or the unbeliever or what was once called freethought, still finds an audience today. Do you remember the late Gary Booth, a member of Tapestry, who proudly bore a name tag saying, "Gary Booth, heretic," on it? Gary wore his free thinking on his sleeve for all to see. I'll eventually consider some books on atheism and free thought and why they may be popular, perhaps as popular today in their own way as is Rick Warren and traditional religion. But first, I want to look more carefully at the free thought tradition and its role in the United States. Free thought, one word, covers several different traditions of religious skepticism. I use it here today because I think it includes and excludes everything I'd like to believe it does. The term dates back at least 200 years. It describes a kind of thinking that doesn't have boundaries imposed by scripture or church tradition. It denies any external authorities from religion over the mind. Under free thought, the mind and its ability to reason is the only authority needed to justify your beliefs. Those within the free thought movement, therefore, deny the authority of the Bible or a need to believe in religious creeds. Freethinkers are not necessarily atheists, but they certainly deny the God that is taught by church tradition. Now, the United States has had a unique history when it comes to the role of religion. It's true that in the 17th century, some groups came here initially because of their devout Christian beliefs. It's also true many did so because they were oppressed for their beliefs in their native homelands in Europe. These two facts seem to have led to two different paths. On the one hand, with a newly found home where religion could be practiced freely, some of them used that freedom to proselytize, wanting their views to become established as the law of the land. I call that the freedom to persecute as they please. On the other hand, some had such abhorrence for the religious tyranny in the old country that they were determined to promote true religious freedom so that no one religion could dominate others. These two paths were to some extent incompatible. One led to theocracy, the other to religious liberty. When the time came to write the Constitution, of course, the call for religious liberty became the law of the land, though the longing for theocracy and a nation and government based on explicit Christian precepts took solid hold in many segments of society in spite of the Constitution. That longing still exists today. Alongside both views, a relatively new kind of thinking about religion was taking shape. It took the position that traditional religion is not only inadequate, it is misleading. That the only oracle for true belief is reason, not Bibles, not clergy, not creeds. That voice was the American expression of Enlightenment thought that had been prominent in much of Europe during the previous 50 years or so. This view was often seen with some justification as being hostile to religion in general and Christianity in particular. Those who held some sympathy for that new line of thinking tended to call it free thought, and those who felt that way were called freethinkers. Those who were horrified by this new school of thought were more inclined to call it infidelity, and those who believed that way were infidels. Now, the word infidel was coined to indicate simply that someone does not practice obedience or fidelity to religious creeds. In that sense, of course, Unitarians are infidels. And that's fine by me. The free-thinking school of thought traces back to the earliest days of the nation. Among the earliest proponents was Ethan Allen, a hero of the American Revolution. As in the tradition of free thought, Ethan Allen believed that traditional Christianity, with its demand for dogma, was an impediment to the strength of human reason. He wrote that witchcraft and priestcraft were introduced into this world together, and he made it clear that in his view, they shared the same superstitions. Allen's voice was followed by an even stronger freethinker, Thomas Paine, who was respected for his political call for liberty, but was held in contempt by many for his critique of the church and creeds. In his well-known book, The Age of Reason, Paine spoke of the Bible as, quote, "the trash the church imposes on the world as the Word of God. This is the collection of lies and contradictions called the Holy Bible. This is the rubbish called revealed religion," close quote. Those are obviously strong words. Yet Paine's animosity was toward the church and Orthodox Christianity. Paine himself was a deist, not an atheist. He held a strong belief in the God of deism. Elsewhere he wrote, "My motive and object in all my publications or religious subjects have been to bring man to a right reason that God has given him, to impress on him the great principles of divine morality, justice, mercy, and a benevolent disposition to all, to excite in him a spirit of trust, confidence, and consolation in his Creator, unshackled by the fable and fiction of books, by whatever invented name they may be called." I mention deism because historically it falls under the umbrella of free thought. Deism is the view that God created the world but does not interfere in it. Deists were at least suspicious of, if not often hostile to, the creeds and the Orthodox Church. And it is true that many of the founders of this country fall within the deistic school of free thought, certainly Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. While most of the country revered Washington as a war hero who spoke very rarely about religion, Thomas Jefferson was especially detested for his views as a deist and for his critical traditional Christianity, for his criticism of traditional Christianity. Timothy Dwight, then president of Yale University, wrote a treatise he entitled "The Triumph of Infidelity," and said of Thomas Jefferson that he is absolutely destitute of wisdom as will as principle. Here's an interesting piece of trivia dealing with infidelity. In the early 19th century, as Harvard College was increasingly coming under the influence of Unitarians, Yale was supported by the establishment as the protector of, quote, true Christianity against the heresies of the Harvard faculty. In his treatise against infidelity, Yale President Timothy Dwight included not just deists and atheists, but also Catholics, Unitarians, and Universalists, and by inference, Harvard College itself. I should also say a word about the relationship of Unitarians and Universalists to the tradition of free thought during this period. This is in the early 19th century. The Unitarians were certainly not aligned with the anti-religious stand of Thomas Paine. The New England Unitarians were not sympathetic to Jefferson's form of rebellious deism, yet the Unitarians were solidly attached to the Enlightenment embrace of reason as more important than creed. For many traditionalists, such as Timothy Dwight, this was enough to indict Unitarians as infidels. Universalism is also part of this story. Universalists were known throughout the country, and especially in the Midwest, for offering a platform for unpopular causes, whether they agreed or not with the speaker. Universalism in general disavowed the more extreme versions of free thought, like that of Thomas Paine, but they were often accused of it because they gave speakers a forum. Free thought in America reached its zenith in the 19th century. While traditional religions held strong allegiance among most citizens, important voices of free thought were becoming popular. The best known of these was Mark Twain, a skeptic and a prominent writer against traditional churches and creeds. Twain famously said, somewhat mockingly, "There is only one true religion, several of them." The poet Walt Whitman was likewise a defender of free thought. But the strongest voice of all was that of Robert Ingersoll, a popular lecturer on many subjects, including his agnosticism. He was proud to bear the nickname of the Great Infidel. In the 19th century, before television or radio or amusement parks, the public lecture was an important form of entertainment and became quite popular. Ingersoll spent his entire career on the lecture circuit and spoke on a variety of topics: women's suffrage, Shakespeare, politics, evolution, and so forth. But his most popular topic was religion and agnosticism. His name was as widely known in those days as Dr. Phil is known today. And tickets to his lectures went as high as $1, a very steep price at that time. In New York City, ticket scalpers could get double that for standing room only tickets at a full house lecture venue. Ingersoll had an engaging lecture style that attracted masses of people. It is said that he would memorize his 3-hour speeches, and he had dozens of them. I admire that. On the topic of religion, his favorite subject, was not only the hypocrisy of the traditional church, but also the damage it had done over the centuries by condoning violence against innocent people. Here's a snippet of Ingersoll's style in a lecture on heretics and heresies. I quote, "Men and women have been burned at the stake, so remember, these have been capital offenses in some times and in some places. For thinking there is but one God, for thinking that there was no God, for thinking that the Holy Ghost is younger than God, that God was somewhat older than his Son, for insisting that good works will save a man without faith, that faith alone will do without good works. Burned at the stake for declaring that a baby will not be burned eternally because its parents fail to have its head wet by a priest, that is, baptized. For speaking of God as though he had a nose. For denying that Christ was his own Father. Burned at the stake for contending that 3 persons rightly added together make more than one. For believing in purgatory. For denying the reality of hell, for attending Mass, for refusing to attend Mass, and for carrying a cross, for being a Catholic, for being a Protestant, for being an Episcopalian, a Presbyterian, a Baptist, and for being a Quaker. In short, every virtue has been a crime, and every crime a virtue. The church has burned honesty and rewarded hypocrisy." Close quote. I just abbreviated the list that Ingersoll gave of the so-called mortal sins for which people have been executed by the church. What I read was less than half of what Ingersoll listed, but I think you get the flavor. Ingersoll died in 1899, though the free thought movement remained vigorous up to World War I. And then something happened. For most of the 20th century, the free thought movement, skepticism, agnosticism, atheism, unbelievers, and infidels, lost much of its influence and held a very low public profile. The movement was far from dying out, but it no longer seemed to pique the public's fancy. There have been intellectuals like Bertrand Russell, but there has never been a voice like Paine or Ingersoll to attract public interest. Why did the free thought, which was a major cultural phenomenon for 150 years, become so minor in the 20th century? Because the free thought critique of the church was having some effect. At least the mainline churches were opening to more liberal theologies that were less harsh and judgmental. Churches spoke of religious tolerance, and ecumenical organizations were formed for cooperation among traditions that at one time killed each other. The church's hold over public policy loosened as courts began enforcing separation of church and state, such as banning prayer in schools and recognizing religious minorities. The culture that in the 19th century was shocked, but still intrigued by the irreverent writings of a Mark Twain, by the 20th century was no longer shocked, and thereby perhaps less intrigued. Freethought never ascended to dominate the culture, but it influenced so much of our society that it eventually lost its shock value. And in losing its shock value, it also lost its strength to challenge the dominant culture. But what is interesting is that there seems to be a new wave of freethought, especially of the more extreme schools. In his book, The End of Faith, Sam Harris declares that it is time to recognize religion itself as the enemy of human civilization. He carefully recounts all the damage religion, whether Christian, Muslim, or Hindu, and whether fundamentalist or moderate, all the damage religion has done to humanity. Another bestseller, The God Delusion, is by British biologist Richard Dawkins, one of the best writers on science for a broad audience. The God Delusion is both a philosophical defense of atheism and an all-out attack on religion everywhere. Dawkins takes no prisoners, allows no slack. Dawkins has a new book published earlier this month entitled Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, An Introduction to Modern Atheism. A review in advance of publication says, dissecting everything from Adam's abuse of Isaac to the construction of a snowflake, Outgrowing God is a concise, provocative guide to thinking for yourself. Neither Harris nor Dawkins make room for religious liberals or moderates as different from fundamentalists. Religion itself is a disease, and whether one is at stage 1 or stage 5 of the disease, he or she is still infected and sick. It's not unusual that such books are being published. What is unusual is that they are so popular. For most of the 20th century, such books were limited to small audiences, usually those already convinced. But these books, including Dawkins' new one, I suspect, and others like them, became extraordinarily popular. So has Freethought made a comeback? No one can say for sure. I do believe, however, that people are becoming more nervous about the influence of religious fundamentalism, especially after 9/11. In the last 2 decades of the 20th century, religious fundamentalism grew in influence. And of course, with 9/11, we began to understand more clearly the real threat of religious fundamentalism to destroy not just our way of life, but our very lives. In the face of such fanaticism, people became wary of religious fundamentalism of any stripe. Where once it was untoward to say anything negative about religion, religion has lost some of its luster and immunity from criticism. Now, I appreciate free thought and free thinkers, even the more radical ones like Thomas Paine, Mark Twain, and Robert Ingersoll. When I read their critiques of religion and the church, I tend to cheer them on. Sometimes they exaggerate to make a point, but their perspectives were healthy and needed when they gave them. The religion they critiqued was, by and large, just as they said it was: rigid, intolerant, divisive, and destructive. But now, more than a century later, religion has broadened beyond what they would have recognized. There is such a thing now as religious tolerance within a religious perspective, although I prefer the word diversity. There are believers who keep an open mind. Mainstream Christianity no longer seems a threat to my welfare or anyone else's. The threat still exists in various fundamentalisms, however, whether Christian or otherwise, but by and large, American religions are more open to civil discourse than they were during the heyday of free thought. But I'm still somewhat troubled. For me, one practical definition of fundamentalism is this: a fundamentalist is a person who feels personally threatened if someone believes differently than they do. I say that this is a practical definition because I know it doesn't have anything to do with what people believe, though it has everything to do with how they believe it. The trouble I'm having is that the new wave of free thought seems to fall under that definition of fundamentalism. One gets the feeling that writers like Harris and Dawkins are on a crusade to eliminate metaphysical and religious error from the face of the earth, that any belief different from theirs is a threat. Another writer who blends religion with science is the physicist Freeman Dyson, who wrote a review of Breaking the Spell, another bestseller that critiques religion, though with less vitriolic fervor. Breaking the Spell by philosopher Dennis Dennett tries to demystify religion into a natural human quality that can be studied scientifically. But in his review of Dennett's book, Dyson makes this cogent observation. There are two kinds of atheists: ordinary atheists who do not believe in God, and passionate atheists who consider God to be their personal enemy. I suppose that helps identify my uneasiness with this new wave of free thought. As with religious fundamentalists, the new freethinkers seem to take it personally if someone believes differently about religious ideas than they do. The difference between free thought in the 19th century and free thought now is that now there are strains of religion that are open and diverse and no threat to human welfare. I agree that we are facing a new threat of religious fundamentalism and that threat needs to be stopped. Where I differ is this. In their view, Christian and Muslim fundamentalism can be stopped only when humanity rids itself of all religion. I believe that goal is utopian and untenable. Rather, it seems to me that the best antidote to today's fundamentalism is to strengthen and encourage some Unitarian principles within Christianity and Islam, those elements and traditions that are diverse and open and promote cooperation and peace. The difference between the old freethinkers and the new freethinkers is that we live in a world where alternatives to fundamentalism do exist. If someone believes differently than we do not have to feel personally threatened, because to feel so threatened is to embrace the spirit, if not the practice, of fundamentalism itself. And that, my friends, is something to avoid. So be it.